chapter 1. Before the gods and the birth of everything, in the beginning there was nothing, and then there was everything. Before Zeus hurled lightning from the Olympus, before Poseidon raised storms across the wine-dark sea, before Aphrodite stepped from the foam of the ocean onto the shore of Cyprus, before any of the gods whose names we know had drawn immortal breath, there was chaos. Not chaos in the modern sense, not disorder or confusion, but chaos as the ancient Greeks understood it. The yawning, fate, formless void from which existence itself would eventually emerge. The word in Greek, chaos, means something closer to the gap, the opening, the primordial emptiness that preceded all things. It was not nothing. It was the potential for everything. This is how Hesiod, the Greek poet who lived and wrote in the 8th century BCE, begins his Theogony, the birth of the gods, one of the oldest and most important texts in the Western literary tradition. Hesiod was not inventing these stories. He was recording, synthesizing, and giving literary form to a mythological tradition that was already ancient in its own time, that had been passed down through generations of oral transmission by poets and priests, by mothers telling stories to children around fires that had been burning. When Hesiod wrote that in the beginning there was chaos, he was encoding in written Greek a cosmological understanding that reached back to the very beginnings of Greek religious thought. Chaos, according to Hesiod, arose the first primordial entities. Gaia, the earth, emerged vast and solid and generative, the foundation on which all life would eventually stand. Tartarus arose, the deep abyss beneath the earth. Ultimateness below even the roots of the mountains. Eros came into being, not yet the playful winged boy of later mythology, but the primal force of love and attraction, the power that would draw things together and make creation possible. And Erebus arose, darkness, and Nyx, the night, who would become one of the most ancient and most powerful of all divine entities. What is remarkable about this cosmological vision, how it differs from the creation narratives of other ancient cultures. There is no creator god in Hesiod's account, no divine architect who shapes the world from outside it, no supreme being who speaks existence into being. The world creates itself through a process of spontaneous generation and sexual reproduction that is simultaneously mythological and almost in its instance, that what exists came from what previously existed through processes of transformation rather than creation ex nihilo. This cosmological vision reflects something deep in the Greek intellectual character, a willingness to look for explanations within the natural world rather than beyond it, to seek the origins of things in the things themselves. Gaia and Oranos, the first divine couple from herself. Without male partner, Gaia brought forth Oranos, the sky, who would become her husband and the father of her children. She also generated the mountains and Pontus, the sea, and then Gaia and Oranos lay together. And from their union, the first generation of truly divine beings, the 12 Titans, who would rule the cosmos before the Olympian gods displaced them. Among the Titans were Oceanus, who encircled the world as a great river. Hyperion, the sun's precursor. Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory, who would later become the mother of the Muses. Themis, divine law. Cronus, the youngest, the and most cunning of the Titans, who would become the father of Zeus. And Ra, who would become Zeus's mother. Oranos, however, feared his children. According to Hesiod, hated them from the moment of their birth and refused to allow them to emerge from Phalom into the light of day, pushing them back into the earth as soon as they appeared, causing Gaia terrible pain. This act of divine infantist, or more precisely, divine imprisonment, is one of the foundational traumas of Greek mythology, the first expression of a pattern that would recur throughout the divine stories. The fear of powerful fathers that their children will surpass them, and the violent measures they take to prevent it. Gaia, suffering and furious, fashioned a great adamantine sickle and gave it to her youngest son Cronus, who had been willing to act against his father. That night, when Oranos came to lie with Gaia, Cronus struck with the sickle and castrated his father, throwing the severed genitals into the sea. From the blood that fell upon the earth arose the giants, the Erinyes, the Furies, and other terrible beings, and from the white foam that formed around the severed flesh floating on the waves of the sea, there arose, in time, Aphrodite, the goddess, born from an act of divine violence, carried on the sea to Cyprus. It is one of the most extraordinary images in all of mythology. Beauty and love born from castration and ocean foam. Eros arising from the wound of Eros' suppression. Up chapter 2. The Titans. The first age of the rain. The Golden Age, its price, Uranos deposed Cronus, and his sister wife Rhea took power over the cosmos. Ancient sources, particularly Hesiod, describe the age of Cronus as the Golden Age, a time of extraordinary peace, prosperity, and ease in which human beings, newly created, lived labor or suffering, feasting on the abundant gifts of the earth and dying peacefully, as if falling into sleep. The Golden Age is one of the most persistent and most poignant of all mythological ideas, or memory, or the imagination of a time before things went wrong, before suffering entered the world, before the gap between divine perfection and human limitation became too painful to ignore, But Cronus carried within him the same fear that driven his father Uranos to violence. An oracle had warned him that one of his own children would overthrow him as he had overthrown Uranos. His response was identical to his father's in its impulse, if different in its method. As each of Re's children was born, Cronus swallowed them whole. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon, 5 divine children, each swallowed by their father before they could grow to threaten his power. The image is grotesque, and deliberately so. Cronus represents time. In one ancient interpretation of his name, and time devours its own creations. Everything that comes into being is eventually consumed by the process that generated it. Re, desperate to save her youngest child, deceived Cronus, as Gaia had once deceived Uranos. When Zeus was born, she wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and presented it to Cronus, who swallowed it without suspicion. The infant Zeus was hidden in Crete, on Mount Ida, or in the Dick cave, depending on the version of the myth, where he was nursed. He was nursed by the goat Amalthea, from whose broken horn would come the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, and protected by the Curies, who clashed their shields and cymbals to drown out the infant's cries. Zeus grew to maturity in Crete, hidden from his father. And when he was old enough, he returned to challenge Cronus and compel him to disgorge the swallowed siblings, the Titanomachy. The war that made the war a war between the Olympians, led by Zeus, and the Titans, led by Cronus, is called the Titanomachy, the Battle of the Titans. And it lasted, according to Hesiod, for 10 years. It was not merely a war between divine generations. It was a cosmic struggle threatened to unmake everything Gaia had created. The Titans were the older, more established powers. The Olympians were younger, more flexible, and ultimately more cunning. The outcome was determined not only by Zeus's own formidable power, but by the strategic alliances he built. Particularly his decision to free the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed giants, from the prison in which Uranos had originally confined them. The Cyclopes, grateful for their liberation, gave Zeus his most iconic weapon. Poseidon his trident. They gave Hades the cap of invisibility. Armed with these divine weapons, and supported by the enormous strength of the Hecatoncheires, who hurled 3 honeyed boulders at the Titans simultaneously with their 100 hands, the Olympians eventually prevailed. The defeated Titans were cast into Tartarus, deep beneath the earth, where they were confined behind bronze gates and guarded for eternity by the Hecatoncheires. Atlas, one of the Titans who had fought most fiercely against the Olympians, was given specific punishment: to stand at the western edge of the world and hold the sky upon his shoulders forever. With the Titans defeated and imprisoned, Zeus and his siblings divided the cosmos among themselves. The division was made by lot. Zeus received the sky and the dominion over all, becoming the king of the gods. Poseidon received the sea. Hades received the underworld. The earth and Mount Olympus were held in common. This division, divine authority, reflects something that scholars of ancient religion have lauded about the Greek divine system. Is fundamentally political. The gods are organized on the model of a Greek aristocratic society, with a king at the top, lords controlling specific domains, and a complex web of relationships, rivalries, loyalties, and conflicts governing the interactions among them. Chapter 3. The 12 Olympians. The divine Zeus, god of Envous, is the most complex figure in the Greek divine pantheon, and one of the most complex figures in all of world mythology. He is simultaneously the supreme ruler of the cosmos, the enforcer of divine and human law, the god of the sky and the thunderbolt, the protector of suppliants and strangers, and in a dimension of his character that receives enormous attention in ancient literature, an insatiable pursuer of both divine and mortal women, whose amorous adventures generated some of the most famous stories in Greek mythology, and produced an extraordinary number of divine and semi-divine offspring. His name, ancient measure. Zeus is linguistically cognate with the Latin deus, God, and the Sanskrit dios, and both derive from the Proto-Indo-European root Deus Pater, Sky Father, which tells us that the worship of a supreme sky deity goes back common ancestor of most European and South Asian languages. A tradition at least 1,000 years old. The Zeus of classical Greek religion is the product of a long evolutionary process, which this Sky Father tradition was merged with other divine conceptions. The storm god, the king of the divine assembly, the upholder of cosmic and moral order, to produce a figure of extraordinary theological richness. The thunderbolt that Zeus wields is not merely. It is the visible sign of divine power operating in the natural world. The moment when the divine and the physical invest in the most dramatic possible way. When lightning strikes, the ancient Greek saw the hand of Zeus. When storms gathered over the mountains, it was Zeus assembling his forces. When the sky cleared after rain and the sun returned, it was Zeus restoring cosmic order. This identification of divine power with meteorologinama, common across many ancient religions, gave religion a quality of immediacy that modern readers sometimes miss. The gods were not distant or abstract, but immediately present in the world, visible in every thunderstorm, every sunrise, every earthquake, every breaking wave. Hera, queen of heaven, Hera, the wife and sister of Zeus, is often misread, is offered by audiences primarily through the of her role as the jealous wife pursuing Zeus's illegitimate children. This reading, while not entirely wrong, Hera's persecution of Heracles, of Io, of Semele, and of many others is well attested in ancient sources, drastically underestimates the theological significance and the independent dignity one of the most ancient Greek deities. Hera was worshipped as a major independent deity long before she became identified primarily as Zeus's consort, and in her ancient form she was a goddess of immense power whose domains included marriage, childbirth, the protection of women, and, at certain cult sites, particularly at Argos, a much broader sovereignty that may recall a pre-Olympian tradition in which she was the chief deity of the region. The tension in Hera's mythology between her independent power and her subordinate position as Zeus's wife reflects something real about the position of women in Greek society, and perhaps something real about the historical process by which the Olympian divine order was established. Modern scholars of ancient religion have argued, with varying degrees of persuasion, that the myths of Zeus's conquest Hera, and of the establishment of their marriage preserve memories of political and religious process by which the Zeus-worshipping cultures of the northern Greeks absorbed and partially subordinated the goddess traditions of the older Mediterranean peoples. Whether or not this historical reconstruction is correct, the theological reality of classical Greek religion is that Hera is both supremely powerful and perpetually subordinated. A tension that generates much of the dramatic energy of the Olympian myths. Poseidon, Demeter, Athena. The great middle gods, Poseidon, the god of the sea, earthquakes, and horses, is Zeus's most powerful peer and most persistent rival, his trident, like Zeus's thunderbolt, weapon and symbol of power over natural forces. He who rules the sea rules the lifeblood of a maritime civilization, like ancient Greece. The Greeks were a seafaring people to extraordinary degree. The sea was simultaneously their highway, their foods, their avenue of trade and colonization, and their greatest source of danger. The divine power that governed the sea was therefore among the most important and most feared in the pantheon. Demeter, the goddess of grain and the harvest, occupies inequality simultaneously domestic and cosmic. As the divine power responsible for the fertility of the earth, she was one of the most important deities in a civilization agrarian, but fundamentally agrarian, that a Greek birth was, in a sense, Demeter's gift, but the myth that most powerfully defines Demeter's character the story of her daughter Persephone's abduction by Hades, and the Divine Mother's grief that made Earth barren and until her daughter was returned, gives her a dimension transcends agriculture. Demeter's grief is a mythological explanation for the seasons. It is also one of the most psychologically powerful stories in ancient religion. The love of a mother for her child and the catastrophic consequences when that love is violated. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, crafts, and strategic warfare, is one of the most theologically distinctive figures in the Olympian pantheon. Her birth, from the head of Zeus himself, he swallowed her pregnant mother Metis, makes her the most purely divine of the Olympians, born from divine intellect rather than from sexual union. Her domain of wisdom encompasses both the practical intelligence of crafts and technology. She was the divine patron of weaving, pottery, carpentry, and the higher wisdom of strategic thought, of the kind of intelligence that wins wars root strength, but through foresight, planning, and tactical brilliance. Her city, Athens, was intellectual capital of the ancient Greek world, and the relationship between the city and its divine patron was one of the deepest and most significant in all of ancient religion. Apollo, Hermes, and Ares, the younger Olympians. Apollo is, for many modern readers, the most immediately compelling of the Olympian gods. The god of light, music, poetry, prophecy, healing, and reason, whose identification with the sun in later tradition gave him an almost universal, divine significance. In ancient religion, his most important function was prophetic. His oracle at Delphi, where the Pythia, the prophetic priestess, delivered divine pronouncements, while seated above a chasm in the earth, was the most consulted religious institution in the ancient Greek world. City-states sent delegations to Delphi before major decisions. Sought Apollo's blessing before founding new cities. Kings consulted the oracle before going to war. The oracle's answers, famously ambiguous and open to multiple interpretations, managed to maintain the Apolline reputation for truthfulness, even when the predictions failed to match events. The failure was always in the human interpretation, never in the god. Artemis, Apollo's twin sister, is the goddess of the hunt, of the wilderness, of the moon, and of young women making the transition to adulthood. She is a virgin goddess, one of three in the Olympian pantheon, alongside Athena and Hestia. And her virginity is not merely a personal characteristic, but a theological statement about her nature and domain. She is the mistress of untamed wild spaces, the divine presence that inhabits the forests and mountains, and places beyond human cultivation. Her association with childbirth, apparently paradoxical for a virgin goddess, derives from the tradition that she assisted at her twin brother's birth, making her the protector of women in labor and of newborn children. Hermes, the messenger of the gods, is the divine figure who moves most freely between worlds, between Olympus and the earth, between the living and the dead, between the divine and the human. His role as messenger makes him the divine patron of communication, of travel, of trade, and of the cunning intelligence required to navigate a world full of boundaries and crossing points. He is also the divine trickster of the Greek pantheon, the god who bends rules, crosses lines, and achieves through cleverness what brute force cannot accomplish. His theft of Apollo's cattle as a newborn infant, described in the Homeric hymn to Hermes with obvious delight in the infant god's audacity, establishes his character perfectly. He is never quite trustworthy, never quite bound by the rules that constrain other beings, and always, ultimately, on the side of the cleverness that makes civilization. Ares, the god of war, is perhaps the least loved of the Olympians. His fellow Gullo gods, as well as by modern readers, unlike Athena's war, which strategic and purposeful, Ares represents war at its most raw and brutal. The bloodlust of the pleasure in violence for its own sake, indiscriminate the destruction that accompanies conflict, regardless of the righteousness of either side's cause. In the Iliad, Homer shows Zeus dismissing Ares as the most hateful of all the gods. His most famous mythology involves his love affair with Aphrodite, the goddess of love, a pairing that the ancient Greeks apparently found both scandalous, entirely believable, war and love being the two great forces that most completely disrupt the ordered life of civilization. Chapter 4. Hades and the Underworld. The kingdom of the dead, of the world, all the realms in Greek cosmology. None has exercised a more powerful hold on the human imagination than the underworld. The domain of Hades, the realm of the dead, the place which every human being ultimately traveled, and from which, in almost all versions of the mythology, there was no return. The Greek underworld was a place of fire and punishment in the way that the Christian hell is. Not primarily. Most of the dead went not to Tartarus, the zone of punishment, but to the abyss, the asphodel, a meadows, a gray no neutral, neither happy nor miserable region, where the shades people continued a pale, bloodless existence that was less than life, but more than nothing. The geography of the underworld, elaborately mapped by ancient Greek authors. The dead first crossed the river Styx, or in some versions, the river Acheron, in abode by Charon, the ferrymen who required payment. The coin placed in the mouth or on the eyes of the corpses by its survivors. This was not merely mythological detail. It was ritual instruction, Greek burial practice included the provision of a Corinthian core charon, and the failure provide it meant the shade of the unburied dead would wander the near shore for 100 years before crossing. The three-headed dog Cerberus, guarded the entrance to the underworld, preventing the living from entering and the dead from leaving. Beyond the entrance were the judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus, Aeacus, all former kings, great wisdom and justice, who now assessed the lives of the newly arrived shades and directed them to their appropriate destination. The truly virtuous, the heroes and the philosophers, those had lived in wisdom and justice, were directed to the Elysian fields, a paradise of perpetual bliss and beauty at the western edge of the underworld. Those guilty of the most terrible crimes, those who had offended it or committed the greatest acts of impiety and injustice, were sent to Tartarus, where specific punishments awaited the most notorious sinners. Hades and Persephone, king and queen of dead. Hades himself is one of the most theologically interesting figures in the Greek divine system. He is a god of enormous power, ruler of a realm that eventually contains every human being who has ever lived. But he is not evil. The ancient Greeks did not associate wickedness with moral wickedness. Christian tradition associates the ruler of hell with Satan. He is stern, implacable, and resistant to prayer. Unlike the other gods, he receives no offerings and has almost no temples, because calling attention to death was considered unlucky. But he is also, in his own grim way, just. He maintains the cosmic order that separates the living from the dead, which is a necessary order, even if it is an uncomfortable one. The myth of Persephone's abduction by Hades, and her eventual compromise with the underworld, spending part of each year above the earth, her mother Demeter, and part below as Hades's queen, is the most theologically rich stories in all of Greek mythology. On its simplest level, it is a illogical myth, explaining the origin of the seasons. When Persephone is below the earth with Hades, Demeter grieves, and the earth is cold and barren. When Persephone returns to the upper world, Demeter rejoices and causes the earth to bloom. But the myth is also a meditation on the relationship between life and death, between the generative fertility of the earth above, and the mysterious power of the underworld below, between the grief of separation and the strange productivity that grief can generate. The Eleusinian Mysteries, one of the most important institutions in the ancient Greek world, were centered on the myth of Demeter and Persephone and took place at Eleusis, northwest of west of Athens, where Demeter was said to have rested in her grief. During her search for Persephone, the mysteries were initiation rites, secret ceremonies, that promised a better fate in the afterlife than the gray existence of the ordinary dead. What exactly happened in the mysteries was never to be revealed on pain of death. And the ancient injunction against disclosure was so thoroughly observed that the specific ritual content of the ceremonies remains unknown today. What we know is that participants came away from the mysteries profoundly changed. Ancient sources describe the initiates as losing their fear of death and approaching it with something closer to confidence or even joy. Chapter 5 Heroes, the bridge between gods and men heracles. The greatest of the heroes, the concept of the hero occupies a unique logical niche in ancient Greek religion, distinct from both the fully divine Olympians and the fully mortal ordinary human being. Heroes were the children or descendants of gods and mortals, half divine, half human, who possessed extraordinary qualities that set them apart from ordinary people. Superhuman strength, courage, or cunning combined the vulnerability and mortality that their human heritage imposed. The hero's life was typically characterized by tremendous achievement and tremendous suffering in approximately equal measure. And the relationship between these two dimensions of heroic experience was of the central preoccupations of Greek mythology. Heracles, known to the Romans as Hercules, is the most famous hero in the Western tradition and one of the most logically complex figures in ancient religion. He was the son of Sun and Alcmene, a mortal woman, conceived when Zeus Alcmene disguised as her husband, Hera, furious as latest of Zeus's infidelities. Heracles from before his birth, sending 2 serpents to kill him in his cradle, which the infant strangled with his bare hands throughout his life. Hera's persecution drove him to the acts of both heroism and violence that define his mythology. It was Hera who sent the madness that caused him kill his wife and children, an act whose horror and grief would haunt him for the rest of his life. That was ultimately the reason the oracle at Delphi assigned him his famous 12 labors. The 12 labors of Heracles, assigned by his cousin Eurystheus as penance for the killing of his family, represent an extraordinary catalogue of mythological achievement. He killed the Nemean lion, whose hide was impervious to weapons, and thereafter wore it as armor. He slew the Lernaean hydra, the multi-headed serpent that grew 2 heads for every one cut off. Captured the Cyrenaean hind and the Erymanthian boar. Cleaned the Augean stables in a single day, diverting 2 rivers through them. He defeated the Stymphalian birds, captured the Cretan bull, stole the Mars-Diomedes, obtained the girdle of the Amazon Queen Hippolyte, brought back the cattle of the 3-bodied giant Geryon, retrieved the golden apples of the Hesperides from the garden at the edge of the world, and descended into the underworld, bring back Cerberus, the three-headed guard dog of Hades, Achilles, Odysseus, and the heroes of the Trojan War. The 10-year conflict between the Greeks and Trojans over the abduction of Helen by the Trojan prince Paris is the great organizing myth of the Greek heroic tradition. The story brought together almost every major hero of the age in a single catastrophic enterprise and provided Homer with the material for the Tudus poems in the Western literary tradition. The Iliad and the Odyssey. The war itself is set in motion by a divine dispute. The judgment of Paris, in which the Trojan prince was asked to choose the most beautiful of three goddesses, Hera, Anna, and Aphrodite, and ends in the destruction of one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Achilles is the Iliad's central figure. He is the greatest warrior of the Greek age, the son of the mortal Peleus, and the sea nymph Thetis, whose divine mother dipped him in the river Styx as an infant to make him invulnerable. Holding him by the heel would remain his only mortal weakness. The Iliad is not a simple story of heroic glory. Glory is a profound meditation on the costs of heroic excellence, on the rage that drives the greatest warrior, and the destruction that rage leaves in its wake, on the relationship between individual glory and collective catastrophe, on what it means to be mortal in a world. Immortals. Achilles knows he will die young at Troy. The oracle has told him that he can choose a long, quiet life or a short, glorious one. He chooses glory, and the choice consumes him and everyone around him. Odysseus is a different kind of hero, clever rather than strong, a survivor rather than a glory seeker, a man whose great quality is not the Aristeia of the battlefield, but cunning intelligence that finds a way through every obstacle. His 10-year journey home from Troy after the war, recounted in the Odyssey, is the great voyage narrative of Western literature. A journey through a world populated by monsters, gods, woods, and the temptations of mortality and immortality, at the end of which Odysseus chooses to return to his wife and his home and his human condition, rather than accept the immortality that the nymph Calypso offer him. His choice is a theological statement. It is better to be a mortal man, living a fully human life, and separated from everything that makes life meaningful. Chapter 6. With stories that explain the world Prometheus, the firebringer of all the myths. In the Gilgamesh, the story of Prometheus is perhaps the one that speaks directly to the modern world. Prometheus, whose name means forethought, was a titan who, unlike most of his kin, sided with the Olympians during the Titanomachy, and therefore survived the war intact. He became the champion of humanity, the divine figure who gave human beings the tools they needed to survive and eventually to build civilization. And the tool he gave them was fire. The myth, as Hesiod tells, is a story about the origin of the human condition. Why human beings must labor for their food, why they grow old and die, why the relationship between gods and humans is marked by such profound asymmetry. Zeus, furious at Prometheus for stealing firing fire from the gods and giving it to mortals, punished both Titan and humanity. Prometheus was chained to a rock in the Caucasus Mountains, where every day an eagle, Zeus's own bird, came to devour, which regenerated each night so that the torture could be repeated without end. Humanity, punished by the creation of Pandora, the first woman, who was given a containing all the evils of the world, disease, death, suffering, toil, which she eventually releasing them into the world that had previously known only ease. The Prometheus myth, extraordinary in its intellectual ambition, it is simultaneously an explanation of human misery, a meditation on the price of knowledge and technology, and a story about divine injustice that the ancient Greeks were willing to tell and retell without flinching. Prometheus, in Aeschylus's great play Prometheus Bound, is a figure of almost Christ-like suffering, bound, tortured, but defiant, refusing to submit to a power he regards as unjust. The Greek willingness to depict their supreme god as cruel and unjust, and to make a figure who defied that god, the hero of their story, speaks to a quality of Greek religious thought that is genuinely unusual in the ancient world. A capacity for moral criticism of the divine that would have profound consequences for the development of Western thought. Orpheus and Eurydice, love, and the limits of the human. The myth of Orpheus and Eurydice is the ancient world's most powerful story about love, loss, and the human desire to transcend death. Orpheus was the greatest musician who ever lived, the son of Apollo or a mortal king, depending on the version, but universally described as possessing musical gifts so extraordinary that his playing could move rocks and trees, calm wild animals, and alter the emotions of any being that heard him. When his wife Eurydice died from a whirlwind bite on their wedding day, Orpheus did what no other mortal had ever done. He descended into the underworld alive to retrieve her. The descent of Orpheus into the underworld is one of the most beautiful passages in ancient literature. He played his lyre as he walked through the realm of the dead, and his music stopped the torments of the damned. Pause in his labor of rolling boulder up the hill to listen. Tantalus forgot his eternal thirst. The Furies swept for the first time, and most remarkably of all, Hades himself, unmoved by prayer, indifferent all appeals, was pierced by the music and agreed to return Eurydice to the living world on one condition. Os must not look back at her as they made their way out of the underworld. He must trust that she was following. He could not do it. At the threshold of the upper world at the last possible moment, before they would have been safe. They would have been safe? Turned to look at his wife. Some ancient authors explain this as doubt. He was afraid she was not really there. Others explain it as love. He could not bear to wait one more moment before seeing her face. Whatever the reason, the look was fatal. Eurydice was drawn back into the underworld, and Orpheus lost her for the second and final time. The myth has been interpreted as a comment on the limits of art. Even the most powerful cannot overcome death, and the self-defeating quality of a certain kind of love. But perhaps most essentially, it is simply an honest acknowledgement of human limitation. We cannot have what we most desperately want. And the wanting itself is often what undoes us. Oedipus. The myth of the unknowing self, the myth of Oedipus, is one of the most psychologically profound in the ancient world. So profound that Sigmund Freud used it as the name for a central concept in his theory of human psychology, the Oedipus complex. But the myth's original meaning, as Bloklus in Sophocles' extraordinary trilogy of tragedies, is not primarily about sexual desire for one's mother. It is about the limits of human knowledge, about the terrifying way in which the past catches up with the present, about the being between who we think we are and who we actually are. Oedipus was born with a terrible oracle upon him. He would kill his father and marry his mother. His parents, the king and queen of these, tried to prevent the oracle from coming true by abandoning the infant to die on a hillside, his ankles pinned together, hence his, which means swollen foot. He was found and raised by the king and queen of Corinth, who told him he was their natural son. When he grew up and heard the oracle, he fled Corinth to avoid killing the people he thought were his parents, and in doing so, traveled toward his true fate. He killed a stranger on the road, who was, of course, his true father, Laius. He solved the riddle of the Sphinx, and was given the widowed queen of the bees as his bride, who was, of course, his true mother, Jocasta. The tragedy of Oedipus is that he did everything right. He tried to avoid his fate. He acted with good intentions. At every turn, he was a good king and a good man by the standards of his world. None of it mattered. The oracle was fulfilled anyway, through the very measures taken to prevent it. When the truth is finally revealed, Jocasta hangs herself, and Oedipus blinds himself with her brooches, of a gesture of horrified punishment, but also, in its way, a statement about the relationship between sight and knowledge. He had eyes and could not see the truth that was in front of him his entire life. Now he will see nothing. he will know everything. Chapter 7, and more. The other gods of the ancient world, the Egyptian gods. Ra, Osiris, Isis, and the eternal return. Greek mythology does not exist in isolation. It was part of a broader world of ancient religions, that influenced each other, borrowed from each other, and in the Hellenistic period. After Alexander the Great's conquests in the 4th century BCE, began to merge and submerge and synthesize in ways that would have profound consequences for the development of all subsequent Western religion. To understand Greek religion fully, we need to look at it alongside other great religious traditions of the ancient world, beginning with the oldest, spectacular, the religion of ancient Egypt. Egyptian religion is, in its basic structure, extraordinarily different from Greek religion, where the Greek gods are anthropomorphic, human in form, human in psychology, human in their loves and hates and jealousies. Egyptian deities are theriomorphic. Many have animal heads on human bodies, representing the specific qualities associated with particular animals. Ra, the sun god, has the head of a falcon wearing the solar disk. Anubis, the god embalming and the guardian of the dead, has the head of a jackal. Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, and the moon, has the head of an ibis. This zoomorphic quality reflects a theological vision that sees divine power as diffused through the natural world, rather than concentrated in beings who resemble human beings. The myth of Osiris, Isis, and Set is the central narrative of Egyptian religion, and the story of death and resurrection that structured the Egyptians' entire understanding of the relationship between life, death, and the afterlife. Osiris was the first king of Egypt, the divine ruler who taught human beings agriculture and civilization. His brother Set, consumed by jealousy, murdered him, drowning him in the Nile in some versions, cutting him into 14 pieces and scattering them across Egypt in others. His wife Isis, the great mother goddess, gathered the pieces of her husband's body and her extraordinary Mary Pagel resurrected him sufficiently to conceive their son Horus. Osiris then descended to the underworld to become its king. Horus grew to avenge his father's murder by defeating Set and claiming the throne of Egypt. The Osiris myth is a theological masterpiece. It addresses the most fundamental human anxieties, the inevitability of death, the fragmentation and decay of the body, the dove river continuity beyond death, and resolves them through a narrative of resurrection and continuation. Osiris does not escape death. He dies, and permanently, but death is not the end. It is a transformation, a descent into a different mode of existence that is still ordered, still connected to the living world, through the continuing cycle of the seasons and the annual flooding of the Nile. Norse gods Odin, Loki, and Ragnarok. At the other end of the ancient world from Greece and Egypt. In the cold forests and icy seas of Scandinavia and Northern Europe. A completely different divine vision was developing. One that shared certain structural features with the Greek and Egyptian traditions, but differed from them in tone, in cosmology, and above all in its relationship to time and ending. The Norse gods, as recorded in the Eddas, the medieval Icelandic texts that preserve oldest form of Norse mythology, live in a universe that is moving inexorably toward its own destruction. Odin, the All-Father, king of the Norse gods, is one of the most fascinating divine figures in world mythology. He is simultaneously the god of wisdom, of death, of poetry, and of magic. A combination that gives him a breadth of divine authority, comparable to Zeus, but expressed in a radically different way, where Zeus exercises his power from the secure heights of Olympus. Odin wanders the world in disguise, sacrificing comfort and even physical integrity in the pursuit of knowledge. He sacrificed dreams to alive, meaning gaining cosmic wisdom. He hung himself from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, stabbed by his own spear, in order to learn the runes, the magical alphabet that gives power over reality. Thor, Odin's son, is in certain respects the opposite of his father. Straightforward, where Odin is devious, a fighter rather than a thinker, the god of thunder and the protector of mankind against the giants who perpetually threaten to overturn the cosmic order. His hammer Mjolnir is the primary weapon against chaos and destruction, the divine tool that maintains the ordered world against the forces that want to dissolve it. Thor is enormously popular in ancient Scandinavian religion, more widely worshipped than Odin, who was primarily a god of kings and poets, because he is most immediately accessible of the Norse gods, the one whose protection ordinary farmers and sailors and warriors could most directly invoke. Loki, the trickster and shapeshifter, occupies a position in Norse mythology that has no exact parallel in Greek or Egyptian religion. He is the catalyst of most of the great mythological narratives, sometimes helping the gods, often creating the problems they then have to solve, always operating at the boundary of the acceptable and the transgressive. He fathers the 3 greatest monsters of Norse mythology: Fenrir the wolf, chains will at Ragnarok, will break at Ragnarok. Jormungandr the world serpent, who encircles the earth in the depths of the ocean, and Hel, who rules the realm of the ordinary dead, with a face that is half living, and half corpse. His eventual imprisonment under Amma-Inna, bound with the entrails of his own son, while venom drips on his face, forms part of the chain of events leading to Ragnarok, the ultimate doom of the gods. Ragnarok, the doom of the gods, is what most profoundly distinguishes Norse mythology from the Greek and Egyptian traditions. The Greek gods are immortal. The universe they inhabit will continue forever. The Norse know with certainty that they will die. The great wolf Fenrir will break his chains and swallow Odin. Thor will kill the world's serpent and then die from its venom. He will pilot the ship of the dead against the gods. The world will burn and sink into the sea, and yet the Norse gods continue to fight, to feast, to gather the warriors of Valhalla in preparation for the final battle. There is something magnificent in this vision. A divine courage, certain defeat without despair, that finds meaning in the struggle itself rather than in its outcome. Mesopotamian gods system, and before Greece, in the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, in what's now Iraq, the oldest urban civilizations on Earth were developing world's first written religious texts. The Sumerian and Babylonian divine systems are older than any other written mythology, and they share certain structural features with later traditions in ways that suggest either direct influence, which is historically plausible given the extensive trade networks of the Near East, or the existence of shared cultural roots that predate all the separate traditions. The Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, describes cosmos born from the conflict between the primordial god of salt water, Tiamat, and fresh water, Apsu, when the younger gods disturb Apsu's rest. He plans to destroy them, is himself killed by the young god Ea, and his wife Tiamat raises an army of monsters in revenge. The god Marduk, champion of the younger gods, defeats Tiamat and splits her body in two, making the sky from one half and the earth from the other. Human beings are created from the blood of a defeated divine rebel to serve the gods and free them from the labor of managing the world themselves. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest literary works in human history, explores through its Mesopotamian divine framework the question that would preoccupy every subsequent mythology. What does it mean to be mortal? Gilgamesh is two-thirds divine and one-third human, a king of extraordinary power and beauty. But his beloved friend who dies, he is confronted with the reality of death for the first time, and he cannot accept it. He travels to the ends of the earth in search of the plant of immortality, eventually finding it at the bottom of the sea, only to have it stolen by a serpent while he sleeps. He returns home to Uruk with nothing but the knowledge that he will die. And the poem ends with him contemplating the walls of his city, the monument that will outlast him, the human achievement that is the only immortality available to mortal beings. Chapter 8. The Gods in History. How shaped civilization the ten and the city, divine architecture, the relationship between ancient religion and ancient civilization is not merely spiritual. It was architectural, economic, political, and artistic in equal measure. The great temples of the ancient world were not simply buildings for worship. They were the centers of urban economic life. Grain storage, tax collection, the administration of labor, as well as the primary patrons of art and craft. The religious impulse drove ancient peoples to build on a scale and with a technical sophistication that remains astonishing thousands of years later. The Parthenon, built on the Athenian Acropolis between 447 and 432 BCE, is a supreme example in which ancient religion expressed itself through architecture. It was built as the home of a 40-foot golden and ivory statue of Athena Parthenos. Athena the Virgin, created by the sculptor Phidias. The building itself is an exercise in correction and mathematical precision that continues to fascinate engineers. Its columns lean slightly inward. Its platform curves slightly upward. Its column shafts bulge slightly in the middle. All adjustments made to counteract the optical distortions that would make a precisely straight building appear crooked to the human eye. The gods deserved perfection, and the Athenians spent 40 years and a considerable fraction of their Syrian wealth to provide it. When the gods changed, syncretism and religious evolution, one of the most important and least appreciated features of ancient religion is its fluidity, its capacity to absorb, transform, and synthesize divine figures and religious ideas from different cultural traditions. The process of religious synthesis, called syncretism, was not aberration or a sign of theological confusion. It was the normal mode of operation of ancient polytheistic religion, which was generally far more tolerant of religious diversity than monotheistic traditions that succeeded it. When Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire, Egypt, and the territories as far east as modern Pakistan between 300 and 323 BCE, he created conditions for the most dramatic religious synthesis in ancient history. Greek settlers and soldiers encountered Egyptian, Persian, Babylonian, and Indian divine traditions, and the result was a remarkable flowering of new form that drew all of these sources simultaneously. The god Serapis, created in the 3rd century BCE by the Ptolemaic rulers Egypt as a deity who could be by both Greek and Egyptian subjects, combined features of Zeus, Asclepius, the healer god, and the Egyptian gods Osiris and Apis. The cult of Isis from Egypt across the Mediterranean world. It became one of the most popular mystery religions of the Roman Empire, with temples in Rome, Pompeii, and Britain. The Roman practice, Interpretatio Romana, the identification of foreign gods with Roman deities, function. Perhaps the most systematic application of Scritism in the ancient world. Mercury was identified with Hermes, Jupiter with Zeus, Neptune with Poseidon, Mars with Ares, Venus with Aphrodite. When Roman soldiers encountered the Germanic god Odin, they called him Mercury. When they encountered the Celtic god of the sky, they called him Jupiter. This process of identification was not merely bureaucratic convenience. It reflected a genuine theological assumption that the divine powers underlying the cosmos were universal, and that different peoples worshipped the same ultimate powers under different names and in different forms. Chapter 9. The Legacy. The ancient gods live in our world, the gods in language. From Monday to Mercury, the ancient gods have never truly left us. They survive, transformed and sometimes unrecognized, throughout the fabric of modern life. In the names of the days, the week, in the names of the planets, in the language of psychology and medicine, in the stories we still, and the movies, and still make, and the literature we still read. Understanding where these survivals came from is one of the most illuminating ways of understanding the deep historical roots of the world we inhabit. The 7 days of the week carry the names of ancient divine powers in almost every European language. Sunday is the sun's day. Monday is the moon's day. Tuesday is Tiu's day. Tiu being the Norse Germanic war god cognate with Mars. Wednesday is Woden's day. Woden being the Germanic form of Odin. Thursday is Thor's day. Friday is Frigg's day. Frigg being the Norse wife of Odin, associated with love and marriage, cognate with Venus. Saturday, Saturn's day. The Roman god of time and agriculture. Every week, without necessarily knowing it, speakers of English, the divine figures of two separate religious traditions, the Roman and the Norse, in the simple act of saying, day it is. The planets of the solar system carry the names of Roman gods who were themselves Greek originals. Jupiter the king, Saturn the father of time, Mars the warrior, Venus the lover, Mercury the messenger, Neptune the seeking, Uranus the sky, Pluto the underworld lord. The names of the months trace a similar divine genealogy. January from Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings. March from Mars. May from Maya, a goddess associated with spring. June from Juno, though the Roman Hera, queen of heaven. The gods in art, literature, and the modern world, the influence of Greek and ancient mythologies, art, Western literature. has been so pervasive for so long that it is difficult to appreciate its scope. From the Renaissance rediscovery of classical antiquity, the 18th century's neoclassicism, through Romantic period's passionate engagement with Greek and Norse myth, through the 20th century's use of mythological structure in psychoanalysis and literary theory. The ancient, divine stories have remained central to Western cultural life in a way that no other body of narrative has matched. Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung both drew extensively on ancient mythology as a framework for understanding the human psyche. Freud's Oedipus complex, his naming of the narcissistic personality type after the youth who fell in love with his own reflection, his use of eros and thanatos as the fundamental drives of human psychology. All of these draw on the specific vocabulary of Greek mythology to describe what Freud believed were universal features. Mind, Jung's concept of the archetype, the universal pattern of thought and image that appears across cultures and across time, was explicitly modeled on the recurrence of mythological figures in different forms across different traditions. For both thinkers, ancient mythology was not merely a collection of entertaining stories, but a record of the deepest structures of human psychological life. In the contemporary world, ancient gods have found a new home in popular culture, has introduced them to audiences far larger than any previous generation of readers or worshippers. Marvel's Thor and Loki have become global cultural icons. Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series has introduced of children to Greek mythology through contemporary adventure fiction. God of War and numerous other video games have created interactive engagements with ancient divine figures that reach audiences who would never a copy of Hesiod or Homer. The ancient gods are more widely known, if deeps understood, than at any previous time in history. The Chapter 10. Why the gods still matter. The questions that never go away. We have traveled a long distance in this story. From the primordial void of Hesiod's chaos to the digital screens on which Odin appear in 21st century entertainment. Along the way, we have encountered divine figures of extraordinary variety. The Olympians of Greece with their all too human passions and their cosmic power. The zoomorphic gods of Egypt with their profound meditations on death and resurrection. The doomed heroism of the Norse divine world. The ancient wisdom of Mesopotamia's divine narratives. And we have seen how these traditions are not merely historical curiosities, but living presences have shaped and continue to shape the world we live in. The question we're asking at the end of this journey: why do these stories persist? Why, in an age of scientific understanding that can explain the lightning that was once Zeus's thunderbolt, and the tides that were once Poseidon's domain? Do the ancient divine narratives continue to hold such power over the human imagination? The answer, I think, has several dimensions. At one level, the myths persist because they are beautiful, because they are among the finest stories ever told. Stories shaped by centuries of oral transmission and written refinement into a form, near perfect narrative economy and resonance. A story that has been told and retold for 3,000 years, and that continues to move. It's doing something purely transient entertainment cannot do. At a deeper level, the myth persists. Because they address questions science answer. Not because these are questions beyond human knowledge. Because they are questions about meaning rather than mechanism. Science can tell us how the universe came to be. It cannot tell us why we are here, or what we owe to each other, or how we should face death, or what love demands of us. The ancient myths addressed these questions directly in the only form in which they can be addressed. Through story, through image, through narrative that captures the felt texture of human experience in a way that philosophical argument or scientific explanation cannot. The gods of the ancient world were projections, magnificent, frightening, beautiful projections of the forces and values that ancient peoples found most powerful in their experience of the world. Zeus's thunderbolt was the power of nature in its most dramatic form. Hera's jealousy was the pain of violated loyalty. Demeter's grief was the love of a mother made cosmic. Orpheus' backward glyphy quality of a certain longing. These were not merely the concerns of people who lived 3,000 years ago. They are the concerns of every human being who has ever lived, and they will be the concerns of every human being who ever will. As long as there are human beings who love and lose and die and wonder why, the stories of the ancient gods will continue to matter. Epilogue, Mount Olympus, and the modern sky, the summit that Mount Olympus stands in northern Greece, rising nearly 3,000 meters above the Aegean coastal plain. Climbers still reach its summit every summer, and when the clouds part and the view opens across the wine-dark sea toward distant shores of Asia Minor, it is not difficult to understand why the ancient Greeks placed their gods here. There is something about the scale of the view, the physical altitude, the sense of standing at the junction of earth and sky, feels genuinely divine. To people who know perfectly well that no immortal council gathers in the mountain's peaks. The ancient gods are gone, in the sense that there are no longer large communities of people who worship Zeus or Ra as their primary religious practice. but they are not gone in the deeper sense of being without influence, with presence, without the capacity to move the human heart. They live in our language and our astronomy, in our art and our literature, in our psychology and philosophy. They live in the structural bones of the story we tell. The hero's journey, the trickster's transgression, the divine love that crosses impossible boundaries, the mortal who looks back when he should not. They live in the questions we cannot stop asking about why we are here, and what it all means. The divine stories of the ancient world are their deepest essence, the record of everything human beings have found most powerful, most full, most terrifying, and most necessary in their experience of being alive. The gods were never entirely outside us. They were always the names we gave to the forces within us and around us that exceeded our ordinary understand or to manage. In that sense, the gods have not. They have simply stopped requiring temples. They live now in the places where human beings have always found them, however they do choose to name them. In the storm and the sea, in the grief of loss, in the loss and the joy of creation, in the stories, we cannot stop telling about who we are and how we came to be here, and what, if anything, we owe to something larger than ourselves. Mount Olympus still stands, and of every person who has ever looked up at the sky and wondered, the gods are still there.